Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I'm Gregg Gordon from SSRN. I know many of you, but not all of you. We're kind of a repository that hangs out in social sciences and humanities, and strongly support open access. That's all I'll say for SSRN. Thank you to Microsoft, Digital Science, and all of you for being here. Amy asked me to put together a panel on metrics, and I said, yeah, maybe, not really sure I want to do that. And I said, can I do it a little bit differently? And she kind of played along, kind of playing the straight man. And I said, I don't want to do one where we talk about the difference between ALMs and Altmetrics and gaming and all that kind of stuff that bores us to tears, especially right after lunch. So she said, my gosh, the title of this workshop is Shake It Up. So do whatever the hell you want. So we're going to try to shake it up. You know, Margie said that there's a lot of different ways to think about metrics and think about the way that they're used and think about the way that they actually enter into conversations to maybe be a little bit helpful instead of dogmatic or the grail that a lot of people start talking about them. And what we're going to try to do right now over the next session is give three speakers, three very knowledgeable people from different perspectives, a chance to share how they see metrics working in the world today. So Mike Taylor from Elsevier will start off with WTF and kind of challenge the way we set and think about metrics. And Ashley will come in from the funder perspective and talk about, you know, what is the impact of the money and give us some real world examples and really kind of the stories that play out for the funders and these nuanced stories in the ways that metrics can help us see something that maybe traditional numbers don't. And Andrea is going to bring it all together at the end with some real world case studies about how different people, not just tenure committees, but different people in the real world use metrics to make some decisions and what we're learning from. Now, I will first off say that whereas Mark said that he has the easiest job by basically just coming and showing up and letting somebody else present for Figshare, I have the second easiest job, which is to stand up here for a minute and actually have really smart people tell you things that may question the way that you think about metrics. So the goal for our session is to leave you with more questions than answers. But we will have some time for Q&A at the end, so maybe we will get them answered. But without any further ado, Mike.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mike Taylor. I live in a world which is constantly changing. Up until 2 weeks ago, I worked for Elsevier Labs, and then I moved to the new and gigantic Elsevier Metrics team. It's so big that we could all sit at a table there. There are three of us, and we're charged with steering the metrics and how Elsevier computes metrics, what those metrics mean and how they're displayed. This is going to be our task for the next few years. And as of this morning, I'm delighted to announce that I started doing a PhD in the subject as well. This is just kind of rounding out my life, really, really busy because I already have 3 careers. So I've been working in metrics for 3 years, and I've been building up a couple of really enormous data sets, most of which comes from altmetrics.com. And one of the things I really want to observe about this is because I am Altmetrics' #1 fan. But any mistakes that appear on this, any conclusions that you don't like, Greg asked me to say things that people are going to disagree with, so I'm going to say that. But I'm only human when it comes to these things. Now, as I said, I work for Elsevier Metrics, and the task that we're working with is to challenge the way that we communicate metrics. The three of us, Gali Halevi, Mike Taylor, and myself, and Mike Taylor, Gali Halevi, Lisa College, and myself, we've all got experience of working in collaboration. I work with the Altmetrics people. I've been hanging out at conferences and writing papers for the last 3 years. Lisa has been working on a project called Snowball Metrics, which is an open, academic-led, scholarly metrics for comparing institutional behavior. So we have a real commitment to open metrics methods. It's really important for us that we do this because we can't go back into a place where there are black boxes that pull out numbers that generate our views and interpretations of what's happening in the scholarly world that can't be challenged and can't be understood, can't be manipulated and reproduced by other people. So our commitment to open methodologies is a really, really important thing. We believe in agnostic data. And we even have a little manifesto. Lisa wrote this pretty good document, the Hefke Statement on Metrics, which is about 90 pages long. There are more elements to the manifesto than just the ones that I've got up here. But nevertheless, this is the kind of thing we're talking about. Don't expect us to be producing numbers that claim to answer all those things, because we live in a world where we're changing to an open environment where people are talking about science and research in ways that they have never had conversations before. And the resultant of this is that there are different people using different kinds of language. There are people asking different kinds of questions that take us away from the very narrow worlds that academia has had for the last 40 years. And we have all known, we've all witnessed what has happened when you try and take one number and expand it out of all shape and use it for reasons. And we're talking about the wonderful journal impact factor, something which can still be used for a variety of things. But we've got all kinds of opinions about it. Generally speaking, used for its narrowest sense, it probably does the job. And one of the great things about 40 years of research is that we can clarify those caveats. We can say what we mean when we talk about it. But what we can't do is then go and say, well, this means that an institution or a researcher's work is valuable or valueless. It's being distorted out of all kinds of use. So our commitment is to move away from having one black box metrics to having a series of open metrics. I would rather have, say, for example, 3 metrics on a subject that go to 80% of answering the question that are clear and validated and crisply understood by everybody who needs to use them. I'd rather have those 3 and say to you, the people who consume metrics and use these things, that this is how you may use them. It's up to you to come to the conclusions about it. I'm not going to tell you what the answer is to your question, but I'm going to give you the tools and the analysis and the data and the validation to make sense of the numbers. So we have this little background where the impact factor and other citation-based metrics are being used to answer questions that they were never designed to answer. And all of a sudden, a few years ago, literally the best thing in the world happens. Altmetrics rolls into town, and it is literally the most exciting thing that I have ever read about in scholarly communication. It promises so many answers for us. It gives us a completely new perspective and an insight into the way that scholarly communication is being committed to the world. It answers all sorts of incredibly interesting questions. And I have spoken at length on the items in the manifesto, with apologies to anybody who was involved in writing it. I had nothing to do with it. I merely read it. I consumed it. I translated it. I agree with most of the points in it. I don't agree with everything, but I agree with most of the points in it. These are a wonderful set of ambitions to have when we are thinking about metrics. What can we do with the new data that's coming out of Altmetrics? But I need to pause, because I'm going to be really mean about Altmetrics, and you really have to remember that I am its #1 fan. We have all these observations, all these hopes that are embedded in the manifesto, and yet when it comes down to looking at the data from the last 3 or 4 years and interpreting it and understanding it, there is a really big gap between what we had hoped to see and what we are actually seeing. These are a few of the conclusions that I have reached from my very large data sets. We hoped that Altmetrics would give a broader picture of the universe. At the moment, it doesn't. We hoped that it would discover hidden publications, and at the moment, it doesn't. And in fact, if you compare the performance of citation-based metrics against non-formal, traditionally, alternative metrics, we find that it's pretty narrow. It's focused on some very narrow subjects, and it doesn't give us the breadth and the width and the richness that we had hoped for. But this is a question of, at the moment, this is the last 3 years. So back in 1976, my teacher said some pretty bitter things. My first report in high school was pretty bad reading. It's still pretty bad reading. But it's pretty much the same for Altmetrics. It's got a lot of promise. It's not smart enough. It doesn't answer the right questions. These are things that we need to work on, to expand, to really get to see some traction going on in alternative metrics. we take it really seriously in Elsevier, but at the moment it's a lot of promise. And here is, if you like, the problem that I have. I'm going to go back to that slide for a moment. Here's the problem that I have, because on the one hand, we have citation-based metrics, and we have 40 years of research in citation-based metrics. We really understand what's going on. We understand disciplinary differences. We can go and buy books on the subject. We can read papers. There are people doing PhDs in it. There are departments, university departments working in bibliometrics. And we don't have the same thing going on in Altmetrics. We have a few PhDs. We have a load of papers. You know, we're really at the beginning of the understanding. And people are being really mean to citation-based metrics. I mean, really, really horrible. And it's because they've been distorted out of shape. But at the same time, we're getting away with awful things when it comes to alternative metrics, because we just don't have the data points, we don't have the background, we don't have the research, we don't have the books, we don't have the papers, we don't have the departments to justify some of the things that are being said about altmetrics at the current day. So this is a thing that I have recently learned in the course of one of my other careers, my theatrical career, is that we know that there is a difference between measuring a thing and the thing itself. This is something that Heisenberg on the left and Bohr in the middle discovered in the 1920s. And anybody who is an astrophysicist or a high-energy physicist can meet me later and beat me up for misreading the script. But what they said was that there is this gap. You need to understand that when you measure the spin of an electron, that what you're measuring isn't the actual spin of the actual electron. It's a proxy for the real thing. What we need to do when you say these things, the responsibility for the researcher is to make those caveats, to speak to their results, but to point out where the weaknesses are. Measurement is always a proxy for the real thing. And this is one of the criticisms that we read of the impact factor, that it is a proxy for impact. It's a proxy for quality. People say these things about citation-based metrics, and they rarely say them about alternative metrics. Knowing that something is a proxy doesn't undermine the essentials of scientific discourse, but it places the onus on the researcher to make the conclusion, to say what it is that they're talking about, to argue their position, to validate what they're saying about their metrics. So as people who are involved in metrics, well, we collected the data responsibly. We make sure that there aren't people who are lying about data or fabricating data. We do really good statistics with it. And we can make the conclusions and we say the numbers. But when we say those numbers, it is up to us as good scientists, as good communicators, to say, these are the caveats, these are the weaknesses, this is the error of probability. And these are things which are not being said about alternative metrics at the moment, and they are being said about citation-based metrics. So when we talk about bibliometric impact, previously it's only been the people who are involved in bibliometrics that talk about these things, right? So if a bibliometrician says, yeah, the impact factor, they're talking one expert to another. They are using language which is qualified by the discipline. It's in the context of a particular kind of discourse. And as a consequence, they don't have to have the same kind of explanatory discourse that we do when we start talking about some of the issues that arise in alternative metrics. And a classic one for me is the case of social impact, which is something that is used a lot, right? So we can talk about all these citations, and we can talk about impact factor, and it's got a capital I and a capital F, and it's got a definition and an equation, and it's got references. But we can't at the moment use the same conversations to talk about alternative metrics because we have to explain everything. And in any case, the data really isn't big enough. For example, in the year up to June the 1st, there were 2.5 million tweets that referred to papers, which is a very, very big number. That's, what, just over one tweet a paper, right? 2.2, yeah, there's 2.2 million papers published a year, so that's just over one tweet per paper. Turns out that almost 90% of papers don't get any kind of Twitter mention. So 2.5 million tweets then go into a very small number of things, and you end up with a mean of about 5.5 tweets per paper that actually get cited. But there's this really huge gulf. We don't see that big gulf when we come to talking about citations. We don't see 90% of papers not being, consumed or read or cited. The differences here are really important when we start thinking about making conclusions about what data means. So what can we say about 2.5 million tweets? Well, we can certainly say that they're really focused. I wrote a paper with Andrew Plume, also of Elsevier, last year. We were looking at the kinds of paper that get the really big pieces of impact. We were expecting, I'll be honest, we did the research expecting to find that there were really trivial papers. There were papers about sex, drugs, and rock and roll that were getting all the tweets. Turns out it's climate science and vaccines, but, you know, okay, never mind. Good paper, find something else out, right? But we talk about, people talk about, there are papers that talk about tweets, Twitter, being in some way analogous to social impact, and yet we're only seeing any indications of this form of social impact in about 12% of papers. And even when we do that, it's a pretty meaningless level of meaningless level of activity, in my opinion, at least, for most papers. Yes, if we look at the top end of those papers, we're seeing great, rich data. At the most publications don't get anything, and those that do get virtually nothing. So it's kind of bullshit, really, to talk about anything meaningful coming out of this, other than knowing the topics that make people tweet. And as soon as we step away from our tightly little world of altmetrics or bibliometrics and we start talking about social impact to real people, they don't have the same definitions that bibliometricians do. There isn't there isn't a generally accepted definition of what social impact is. Certainly if you're a banker or if you work in not-for-profit, then there are definitions that people use on social impact. People try to do this. I mean, there's a whole level of publications that are being made to try and explain, to define what social impact is in very narrow areas. But there's nothing at all in terms of altmetrics, and very little in terms of bibliometrics. So there's a real gap here because people want that answer. They're asking us, what is the social impact of my research? They're asking us all sorts of questions. So take, for example, how we might use different models to think about, in this case, the value of extending a life. I made most of these numbers up, but I would defend them over a pint. So this is a metric that I created to thinking about where you spend the money to invest in extending somebody's life by 10 years. And there's the same numbers, but taking a different kind of perspective. And I thought this was quite an interesting thing to do because we've got two different models, both of which might be defined as being social impact, but actually giving completely different answers using the same data. And I think this is the same kind of thing that we're driving at, that when people talk about social impact and what scholarly communication is after, we don't have a consistent, clear view of what it is to do that. And there are a number of problems getting in the way of us being able to answer these things. He says, skipping through his notes really quickly. Another example would be on internationalization. So if we think about a metric to say whether to produce a number on how internationally focused a researcher is, we need lots of different data, and we can ask many, many different questions. We could say, well, is this person, the question might be, how good is this person at getting money from international funding agencies? The other question might be, does this person spend all their time flying to hotspots in the winter, like Cambridge? What kind of person is this? What's the question you want to know when you're thinking about what internationalization means? Do we want to know whether they're being read in countries other than the one they're writing in? Do we want to know whether they're engaging with researchers in the developing world? These aren't questions that are embedded in the data. We need to take those questions and do a gap between how we are going to go about answering. What does a hypothetical answer look like? What else do we need other than data to answer these questions? Where can we get the data from? How good is that data? And actually, how good is the data? How complete is the data is a really important issue for us because we have this world where in our citation data, we have 40 years of research, so we have an idea of how complete something is. But when the community started building altmetric tools, they weren't thinking to themselves, well, what data do I need to answer this question? Rather, they were saying, who has an API and how can we query it? And if you had an open API that was free and the license terms were unconditional and you could answer queries based on the DOI, then you would be included in that big box of numbers that we get. So Mendeley was in, and Zotero, who either didn't have an API at the time or it was just too hard to work, was out. And other papers, like other software solutions like Papers, don't even make the cut at all because they don't have an API that's open. So we never actually really know how complete, how open the data is. So if we try and make a qualification, we're saying, yes, but I don't know what the answer is. You know, we say that this is a highly impactful paper on Mendeley, and we don't know how it performs on other things. And we know that there is probably a disciplinary difference between Mendeley and Zotero, but we don't know what that difference is yet. So it's very, very hard for us to come to any kind of conclusion, to qualify the data that we have to answer the questions that are being asked. And this is why I want to personally press a big stop button and think to ourselves about the problems that lie ahead of us. Altmetrics, alternative metrics, is such an exciting place at the moment. You know, we have new platforms coming on stream. We have more people talking about things. We have data coming up. We have young people doing PhDs. We have old people doing PhDs. It is a really exciting place to be involved in. But the problem is, right now, is that somebody might take us seriously. And this would be a really big problem. If somebody woke up tomorrow morning and said, right, I'm only going to fund papers that get 5 tweets, or I'm only going to fund research for people who can get 5 tweets. I mean, it's like crazy. This isn't like citation where you can look back at 40 years worth of history and say, we know something about this discipline. This is something which changes every year. There aren't the benchmarks against which we can make comparisons of performance. We have to create these benchmarks. We also have to expand the amount of data. We have a great deal of work to be done. We have to advocate for people to open up their data. We have to ask places that don't have APIs to publish auditable data about usages so we can make comparisons between different applications, so we can draw up a full view of what the behavior is going on. And we have another problem in terms of working from our top down and saying, well, what questions does the community want? Because it's not up to me as an individual or me as Elsevier or any other individual person or other corporate entity to say, these are the questions that we think that you want to answer. Use our number to answer this question. Rather, it is the question of, well, what academics have questions, deans have questions, funding agencies have questions. And these questions need to be defined and worked on and understood. The data needs to be gathered. We need to advocate and argue for the data to be opened up. There are so many questions to answer. I am going to shut up in about a minute. But there are so many questions. I mean, one of the questions that I find so interesting is when you look at an analysis of data, we can see that issues in maths, right, they make the headlines everywhere in the social media, and yet they don't appear on the TV or the news or the radio at all. I don't understand this. There is this massive gaping hole about maths in the mass media. That's really hard to say after lunch. Why is aquaculture so popular in northwestern USA? I can't imagine. But these are questions that can be asked. But at the moment, we don't have the tools to answer them. We don't even have the language to ask about them. So this is why I want to press the stop button and ensure that at least I have a conversation that I know what I'm talking about for the next 15 years, because frankly, that's what my career is going to be doing. Thank you.
Thank you. I just realized while sitting there what my purpose here today was, and it's to be a buffer or potentially an interlude between 2 altmetric presentations. Yes. And to provide a little bit about the funder perspective. I'm actually with Uber Research. We work with funders globally. Very small funders that fund less than $1 million a year in very focused rare diseases, all the way up to the largest usual names, NSF and NIH. And we work with them during the review process to find reviewers and make other decisions. And then also from a portfolio perspective to help answer questions like, what should we fund? So it's our work that we do with funders that is represented here. And it is by no means any answers. It's more of a problem statement and a call for help, generally speaking, when it comes to metrics. So what I would like to share is a little bit about the questions that are being asked today by funders when it comes to metrics and impact, and then share with you a little bit of the perspective of the gap, to use the mind the gap, that we've seen that exists in that need. So a few quotes that we heard recently, but they're representative from what we've heard from many funders, which is for the type of impact that they want to measure, publications for them don't cut it. However, if you connect it with what we just heard, that's really the only data that exists, which is mostly true. So how do you deal with this gap? And also a statement of one of the realities, which is not only is data needed and tools needed and common languages about what is impact and all that, but also just represent here a shift in culture, an awareness that of the need, and to get people thinking beyond the usual and the obvious and the tradition. And what may be slightly ambitious, when, again, you think about the type of data that are available, not only do they want to look beyond the impact within research and how you can measure that with outputs, but also want to dip into health impact and social impacts and economic impacts. So not only are funders, like everyone else, short on data when it comes to research impact, but then want to bring in all these other areas and start answering questions, it's huge. But that's also where many funders are going. And I use the word health here, and this was a quote from a health research funder, but you could put in from any funder in the type of research that they're funding. So an example of the type of questions that are being asked by funders that are unanswered. Again, the problem statement. This is one example of a research to impact framework. And what's interesting is there are many funders out there who don't even have a framework like this. You'll see it at the very largest funders, but in the small to medium-sized funders, they don't have the time to even come up with something like this. What this can help you see is the range of questions and the range of metrics that are needed, that a funder needs. They need data about patient input, with stakeholder engagement. There's more and more patient reviewers, but more data about what's going on. Then in the green there, they're making decisions about what to fund, which leads potentially to new knowledge, which is informing decisions, which hopefully leads to some improvements in care, reduced recidivism. All these things, all of this area is what they're looking at to measure their impact every step of the way. And some of the questions that are within there, and this is probably 4 of thousands, where they're looking for metrics, for indicators, for answers, for data. What's interesting is I thought I'd put it in the order of ambition, where the easiest one came first and followed through. But what's interesting is almost all funders that we've ever spoken to and worked with, they can't answer the question how many researchers are in their state or in their country or in their domain, and have a reliable number that they can use as the denominator for certain metrics. Many are focused on building capacity and expanding fields, so they're asking questions about who they funded. And then these more abstract questions are also being asked, which metrics and data to inform those metrics and the tools in the common language don't exist. And in that framework, you saw huge ambition in the type of questions they want to answer, and so many of them are still stuck answering a basic question like this, which, if you looked at that framework, I kind of have a red box there. It's kind of small. That's where many of them are spending their time and don't have a complete answer, and that is just one little piece of the impact question when it comes to a funder perspective. So you talk about a group of organizations that have huge need and very little insight and, well, little support when it comes to metrics and indicators. Another way to look at it, this is a list of actual indicators that inform that framework, and that red box there are the publication-based metrics. And so if publications are the only data set that is generally available, which is absolutely true, then how are they going to answer the rest of the questions that they're trying to answer? And so we talked about a little bit of those challenges. To connect it to the infrastructure question, you might say that that bridge is the publication data, and the rest of it is completely wide open. Some other challenges, some very realistic timelines of what was your impact. They're asked, well, what was your impact last year? How, if you can't ask, if a researcher has multi-year projects, you can't ask that question every year. How could you ask the funder of those researchers? But they are being asked, what was your impact in the last 12 months? Quite unrealistic. And if you look at, this is a rough approximation from, hey, I have an idea for a project, submit it to an application, to eventually writing a paper and getting citations. If you look at it from the perspective of, if you're looking at national level funders, the political administrations are wanting results within a very short window of time, which is, you wouldn't even be able to measure the citations that came from the projects that were funded at the start of that. So again, very challenging environment. Another challenge is also just how to practically do this. And so sort of as an awareness campaign, a school has started to help with the challenge of research impact assessment. So for any of you, when it comes to metrics and impact and that general topic, it will be in its third year next year. It was held in Banff in the Canadian Rockies, wonderful location, kind of like what we have here with beautiful views. And they're also hosting it next year in Doha, Qatar, which would also be a nice place with nice views. But that gets to the part of the challenge, which is not only is there difficulties in the data to answer these metrics for all the questions being answered, but there's not a common language about what the metrics should be, let alone the tools, let alone the capacity within the funding organization to start measuring their impact. We've worked with organizations that are multi-billion-dollar funders, and they have two people who part of their job is to measure the impact of the research funding. And you can imagine how difficult it would be with all those challenges that come up. So again, more of the problem statement of what funders are facing when it comes to measuring their impact. Thank you.
Much too much. So my name is Andrea Haluk, and I am the co-founder and president of Plum Analytics. So what I'm going to talk about are some real stories of how people are using metrics to talk about research impact. So as Mike started off talking about this, traditionally, how is impact talked about? It's all about the citation count. And so if you're Thomson Reuters, you have a set of publications that they said, this is what we're going to measure with Web of Science. And then there's metrics, citation-based metrics that build off of that data set. If you're with Elsevier and Scopus, again, they decided this is a universe of what we're going to measure that we deem appropriate to be inside of Scopus. And then there's additional metrics that build on that. And you're getting just what was in that original set from Elsevier is deciding what is worthy to be measured. Google Scholar entered the scene, and they have their Google metrics and their citation metrics, and now they've developed metrics as well. So when you take all of those citation-based metrics together, so this is a Venn diagram that looks at a particular book and looking at the 3 different providers of citation metrics and saying, well, you would need all 3 of them in order to tell a complete picture of just citation impact, right? So to get those 153 unique citations, you need all 3 tools to tell you that because they're all sampling from different places. But it's a bigger problem than that to tell this comprehensive story of impact. So if you look at citation counts, that was for the longest time all we could measure. That's visible light, right? We could measure visible light. We can count it. We can talk about it. But there's more that you can measure here, right? The whole electromagnetic spectrum has other things that when you had basic tools like print journals, you can measure certain things. But the world is changing. And now I'm sure people have seen diagrams like this before. What's happening online in 60 seconds, or this is data from 2013. And this is talking about how there's 72 hours of YouTube video created every minute, right? The content is exploding. The amount of data that you can capture is exploding. And of course, this isn't just consumer-based behavior. This also happens around scholarly output. So here are some sources of data exhaust of what researchers produce or people interacting with research produce. So it's more than just a journal article. So you've put your data set, you've shared a data set. You can tell how many times that data set's been downloaded. You have a video that you've produced that talks about your new research approach or educating patients or educating parents of patients. You can get views, you can see how much that's been interacted with. And this is just a sampling, and we harvest from all of these places, and anytime we build this slide, it's immediately out of date, and we have to go search new logos and add more to it. So this is an expanding field. And it gets us to the definition of something called altmetrics. So Mike talked about altmetrics as tweets, and many people, that is synonymous. So they think of altmetrics. There's a company in this space, a digital science company, called altmetric.com, which also, their definition of what altmetrics is one. What we talk about with Plum Analytics is really looking at alt as in complementing the traditional metrics, alt that way. And we honestly, unless I'm asked to speak about altmetrics, we don't even really use the term, because we really consider it all metrics, trying to have this comprehensive view. That full spectrum of metrics is what we endeavor to capture. And we do that so that we can answer the questions and tell the stories behind research impact. And most notably, that hard question of what's happened in the past year. The what have you done for me lately? So citation counts take anywhere from 3 to 5 years to get to the point of where someone has done their research, published a paper, someone else has read it, done their research, their paper went through peer review, and now you've gotten your first citation count. That whole cycle takes years to get to the other side of it. So what's happening in the meantime? What can we use to tell the story in a shorter point of view? And the way that we've looked at this, when we started gathering all that data exhaust, was to gather them into 5 categories. First is usage. So first and foremost, I wrote a paper, did anyone download it? I created a video, did anyone watch it? This is if you ask researchers, what's the primary way you want to tell if your work had any impact? They'll tell you this, did anyone even look at it? So we're constantly trying to add usage, not just for journal articles, but find other kinds of proxies for usage, like books. How many libraries hold a book is a good proxy for book or monograph usage. Captures are when someone has bookmarked something, favorited it, put it as a Mendeley reader, or somehow said, I want to come back to this. And the studies that are being done are showing that captures are a good leading indicator of what will be cited later. And that intuitively makes sense, because if you are using one of those platforms that we're capturing metrics from, and you're a researcher and you're bookmarking something, as you go back to build your reference list, where are you going to go back to? Well, wherever you captured it at, wherever you saved it. So the data does trend nicely with future citations. Mentions are where the stories themselves are hidden. This is where someone's written a Wikipedia page that linked to that book or to that article, where they've commented on it, written a review about it, written a blog post about it. These are all mineable in an automated way to give the researcher who produced that research a way to quickly and easily find what people are saying about it, who are the key influencers that it's interacting with, and really start to learn what's happened with their research. Social media, love to hate social media in many places, right? Because people think, does this correlate with anything else? What we've found is that social media is a great measure of how well promoted something is. So I've written an article, I tweet about it, my followers retweet it, often a millisecond later without even having read it. It's a really great way, especially for early career scientists and researchers, to be able to tell, are they doing a good job at promoting their work? And it gives you that lens into it. And then, of course, citations, they don't go away. They're part of this comprehensive picture. And especially as you look back 5, 10 years, They are the best measure of was this quality research? Is this a seminal article compared to other things? I mentioned before about going beyond just a journal article, and this is the sort of things that you can measure. These are all types of research output. Being able to gather metrics about all of these different things is another way to tell that complete story, or more complete story. And how that all kind of boils down is into these building blocks of article level metrics. So for each and every article, video, data set, conference presentation, each one of these gathering metrics around all 5 categories. And all, the published version of an article, the open access version of an article, the version in an institutional repository, gathering all the metrics and being able to see what, being able to tell that complete story and being able to navigate through to see where those numbers came from, so making it very transparent. So in general, before I jump into the case studies I promised, there's 3 main steps that we go through. The first is to categorize. So you categorize the different types of metrics, right? You categorize by the type of output it is, but you also categorize by what you hope to later get data about. So being able to break it down, if you're an institution, if you're a university, you might care to categorize things by department, by researcher, by lab. If you're a publisher, it makes sense to categorize by books. If you're a funder, you might want to categorize by the grants you fund and the different areas in which you're funding them. And this, if you put that human intelligence in, then when the platform, the technology goes and measures all these data points, you can then analyze out at the other side. So it's putting that structure in, that human intelligence that lets you get insight at the end of the process. So the first case study is University of Pittsburgh. What they do is a couple of different things. So this is an example of a dashboard. So you can see, I do. That's always exciting when you're a presenter and you don't know what kind of fun thing you're holding in your hand. So they have, per researcher profiles, they give a dashboard, researcher by researcher, what impact have they had. They've mapped in their digital collections. So this isn't necessarily work produced by their researchers, but the different subject-based collections that they hold, being able to look at metrics by subject and across the whole collection. Their library publishes 26 journals. So we have article level metrics and journal level metrics about the journals. And then, of course, by department, being able to get views by department and across an entire institution. So the first insight here is when we look at this graph, so this is looking at articles published year by year by year and saying, what can we see? And usage isn't on this chart, but we do have social media, which is blue, mentions yellow, captures, and citations. So if you look at the red bars on this chart, and I guess I should point out this line across the top is the total number of artifacts in a given year. So that's pretty constant year over year. And you can see the citations for the last 2 years, in 2013 and 2014, the red bar is barely visible. I showed this slide at a talk last week, the week before, and someone raised their hand and go, you better tell Pitt they have a problem. Their work's not being cited in the past 2 years. It's like, no, that's not it at all. What it is the citation counts lag. They're just not there yet. But the other categories of metrics, the other things you can see, can help fill in that data to tell you what's happening more recently. So these metrics provide a feedback loop, like the Fitbit you wear on your arm, or the speed limit sign that adjusts and tells you your speed as you're going down the highway a little bit too fast. They're giving you data that you can react to in much more real time and understand what's happening. So here's an example of an article in Pitt's institutional repository. So the article level metrics for this include their download counts here, 75 times it's been downloaded. And this bottom graph is what you would typically see in an institutional repository of what download metrics are there. But you can see that you can fill in across the other categories of metrics, the other types of usage that's happening, all different ways to tell the story about what's happening. If you click on the tweets about this particular article, what you can then see are the conversations that are happening. In this case, you know, a potential funder is tweeting about their work. You can see, you know, different parts of the world interacting with it, researchers connecting the dots. And this kind of data, when embedded in the IR, is much more of a carrot rather than a stick. This is, you deposit here, you get value back out as a researcher, and it helps make that, you know, that feedback loop and go full circle. One of the other things that you can see are, I talk about captures, those bookmarks being a good leading indicator. So looking kind of with a more publisher-centric hat on, you can start to look at the different journals head to head and say, you know, look over a particular time period and say how much are they capturing? How much does this leading indicator show one journal versus another? You can look at, you know, social media per journal, the same kind of things, and drill into the data from there. The next case study I want to talk about is Autism Speaks. And let's see if this auto goes or not. This is typing autism into Google Scholar, right? Doing a quick Google Scholar search. And what's being pointed out here are the publication dates, 2001, 2000, 2002. If you do any general search like this on Google Scholar, you're going to be surprised if you look at the publication dates. There's, in general, nothing newer than a decade ago that show up on your top results in Google Scholar. And the reason for that is if you look at the cited by count, cited by 552 things. Of course, if your relevancy ranking is based on highly cited things, you're going to favor old things. So if you are trying to get the work you're doing exposed, there's a gap here. So Autism Speaks used Plum Analytics in order to tell their community of what they fund. They're, you know, the world's largest funder of autism research, and they wanted a showplace of saying, you know, they're out there raising money, $25 and $50 at a time at, you know, at walks and things like that. They want to tell their donors what they're doing. They want to be able to have their researchers see what other researchers in the field are doing. So here, this is one of their grantees, and you look at the publication year here, and all 5 categories of metrics. There's something to tell. There's data that they can go in and explore and dig into. They fund different proposal areas, and when I first showed this graph to my colleagues, our partners at Autism Speaks, one of the interesting things was they were very excited by this, right? It's 5 bars showing their different proposal areas: biology, treatment and prevention, screening, risk factors, and dissemination. And they immediately said, oh my God, this is amazing. It's like, how? You know, like, I see 5 bars. I'm glad you like our new reporting, but what do you see here? And what they said was, we always thought this, but we never could prove it. That this, when we fund treatment and prevention, the gray bars is how many, the ratio of the amount of social media activity around treatment and prevention is very high. And if you compare that with captures, treatment and prevention barely happening, and for this data set, not a single citation in any treatment and prevention article. So they're saying, we know this has impact for our community, and now we have metrics that back up some of the funding decisions we're making. Similarly, beyond just the numbers, being able to discover those conversations that are happening, what are they saying and where are they saying it, is something else they find important, and to make this all public. This site will be public and open to the entire autism community, and it's something they're very excited and proud to showcase what they're doing. And talk about ROI in a brand new way, right? They've been talking about ROI of what they fund the same way for the past 20 years. They finally now have new data and something new to tell. And not just Autism Speaks, just funders in general. Last case study really quickly is OHSU. They're a medical institution, and one of the things that they're doing is their library is working jointly with the Office of Research to say, we want to compare like with like. We want to compare what we're doing in different disciplines, and there was no easy way to do that. So they took mesh keywords and that ontology and created a custom ontology based off of that that has everything at the same level of granularity, went through and tagged their researchers' output, which they then can feed into a metric system like PlumX, and be able to look, in this case, at metabolic bone diseases, compare all of their researchers' output to that, and be able to find, well, what are the publication outputs that have the most impact in our own researchers' output around this very specific field. So it's taking, again, that intelligence up front of how to structure the data, of what kinds of questions you want to ask, being able to then have the things be, all the metrics and data points be automatically generated so that then you can analyze it out the other end. Other things that they're doing are working with the expanded NIH BioSketch to be able to include these alternative measures of impact as a part of their researchers' proposals and working collaboratively to do that, as well as really focusing on lay and clinical outcomes and things, again, that go beyond just traditional citation counts to help tell that story. And with that, I guess we're in panel mode, right? Yep.
Okay, so we've got a few minutes left for some questions. We kind of took you around the world there with how screwed up everything is and the questions that aren't answered. Some actual case studies that kind of show the ways in which people are using the limited data in creative ways to at least make some comparisons and learn some things. So I will open it up for questions. William?
So at the early session, everyone kind of had to answer the question about platform lock-in and, you know, what are you doing with this? And so Mike Taylor opened this session with a discussion of the importance of openness and transparency for metrics. And I guess the question would be for both of you, is how are you, I guess, you know, leveraging the power of openness to promote, you know, community engagement and trust in the data that you provide?
Sure, I think the biggest thing is to make it auditable, right? There's no secret hidden formulas. There's nothing that we're not exposing the data. And if, when possible, giving a human readable explanation to click through and drill down. So making it transparent as possible is, I think, the best way to address that.
So William is asking me a question. I didn't mention that we provide data and have data. I don't think that's what you're asking about. We collect data globally about what funders are funding at a project level. That's the data that we have. And one way that we are making it open and transparent and helping, as an example, one of the many things we do, the data that we collect, we feed it back into ORCID. So if as a researcher you go to ORCID to sign up for an ORCID ID, you can automatically pull in all of your funding from our database so that you don't have to manually key in all your grants, which then gives everyone who has access to all the ORCID public data files all of that records where it's a person linked to their funding as well as their publications, their employment, work history, as an example.
Great.
Andrea just mentioned something very interesting in your presentation. The question's for you, but if anybody else has an answer too, that would be great. You said that the interest level that people express by clicking and saving things is a precursor, potentially a preview of citations. I'm curious whether that's testable and true. In other words, I want to believe that that's true. I'm not sure I do believe that that's true, because I think that sometimes people are interested in things in ways where it informs them, but they're not necessarily going to cite it later. And so I think there's value in both, but I'm curious if it's really correlated.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some good studies done on Mendeley data, right? Because Mendeley has made their data open and available, and research studies that are showing a strong correlation with Mendeley readers and citations. So it's new, right? It's early, so we don't have, you know, we have 10 years of data accumulating from all these different sources, not 40 years of data, but it's just really people are doing that research to bake it in. And some of it you can start to see that, right? You look at these studies, you see the strong correlation, And as we instrument more and more proxies of how people are using this, hopefully the data trends continues to trend that way.
Jeff?
So Mike, you say we understand citation-based metrics. Who is we? Because given that administrations and people making very important decisions about people's lives don't seem to understand citation metrics, I'm quite concerned that even when we do understand, if we understand the alternatives to these, that we're going to face the same problem. You say that there are a bunch of questions that we need to ask, and from my mind, what I've seen is that the fundamental one is going to be, how can I make promotion, tenure, grant decisions without having to read or understand the work, and in a way that enables me to avoid getting sued. This seems to be the elephant in the room, which is that this stuff is just being misused, period.
Yeah. When I say that metrics, citation-based metrics are understood, perhaps it'd be more accurate for me to say that the material exists for people to understand them should they choose to read it. There are some really good papers available, freely available, that any person can read that surmises 40 or 50 years worth of data that talks about motivations and disciplinary differences and so forth. It is possible to understand these things. Being an idiot with numbers is not restrained to people who have to make decisions about these things. The question about making tenure is one of the things. I mean, you've probably heard me say this before, Jeff, that I live in horror of somebody making funding decisions on the basis of some of this data. Like I say, my big worry is what happens if somebody takes it seriously. At the moment, it's not in a position to take seriously. There was an example used by someone from, I think, from Kudos, about usage data, and in this particular case, she was using it as a great example of how you can get readership through having a social communication policy as a researcher. She used the example of a team of researchers who basically constructed a marketing team around the work they were doing with the ambition of making their paper the #1 downloaded read article on PLOS for a given time period. And they had a whole strategy and a set of tactics, and they managed to do it. Now, there's nothing wrong with the paper. There's nothing bad about the paper. The paper is probably a good one. I wouldn't understand even the abstract, frankly. But nevertheless, there are such distortions available. As Andrea said, taken cold, just looking at these numbers, without the context, without the ability to look at trends, year-on-year trends, disciplinary differences trends. These are just numbers, perhaps, of how well these things are performed. What is interesting is when we look at things like Mendeley, Mendeley counts are a private activity, right? So I'm using Mendeley, I upload a document to it. I don't do it necessarily with the intention of telling the world that I have just added a link to it. So you're measuring a kind of private behavior, whereas for many of these types, you're looking perhaps at the products of what happens when you invest a press release behind it, what happens if you write a blog about it that can be understood by journalists, what happens if you have a large network of friends. And we don't have the data to be able to draw any kind of conclusions other than cite the numbers themselves.
As somewhat of a counterpoint to that, though, when people can game all sorts of metrics, right? And saying, hey, we're going to put a campaign to get to be the most downloaded paper on a certain platform is one case. And what are they going to use that, that researcher, what are they going to put their name on behind that data to say, yes, this is something I did and I'm proud of it and I'm going to put it on my tenure review packet. They'll get found out. An example that I'd like to share is an early career researcher who was trying to put together her tenure and promotion package, and she had written a paper, it was in the humanities, and she'd written a paper that kind of took down the standing wisdom at the time and went out there and said, yeah, this is wrong, and she wrote her paper, and time was going on, and it was not really highly cited, and she's getting nervous, right? Like this, I've invested all of what I want to do on this, and I'm coming up for tenure, and it's not there. It was right at that point that she was given access to her PlumX profile to look at her paper's impact, and that happened to include usage data in this case that she had not gamed. She didn't even know that it was available to her. And she was able to show that this paper in a very niche field, even though it wasn't highly cited, had been downloaded over 1,000 times from their institutional repository. And she was ecstatic, right? Because it gave her new data that said, look, it's starting to get cited, and it's a way to show the impact I'm having in a non-traditional way. And you can be sure she included that in the defense of the work that she's doing. So you have to, there's different ways to look at it, and different times when these metrics make sense to use and other times when they don't.
Any other questions? I think this puts us 2 minutes over. Thank you again for the panelists, and thanks for the audience.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.